Welcome to Pop Psych 101
where we, licensed therapist Ryan and
licensed psychologist Dr. Hayley Roberts,
break down and analyze how mental health is represented in movies, shows, books, and across the pop culture and social media landscape.
We will determine what lines up with real life and what is just pop culture fantasy.
This is Pop Psych 101. Welcome back to Pop Psych 101. I am licensed therapist Ryan Engelstad, here as always with my co-host, Dr. Hayley Roberts.
It's me. It's still me.
Hello, it's still you. Welcome back, Hayley. Welcome back, listeners. It is a thrill to be back. You guys probably don't know, but we haven't recorded in a little while, so we are very happy to be here talking about a particularly devastating movie. And you guys will find out why this movie that we're talking about today, Still Alice, might be one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. We skipped a movie Hayley didn't want to watch because of its scare factor, and I kind of walked into one here. So can't wait to dive into Still Alice. But Hayley, before we do, there's a scene in the movie wherein the family is gathering together, and there's this sort of acknowledgement of like a really good homemade family meal. Like, oh, I smell something when I walk in the door. Oh, is it that meal that I'm hoping it is? Right. So, you know, it got me thinking before we dive into the heaviness that is going to be this movie. What food would that be for you? It doesn't have to be like family or a parent meal so much as just like something that represents home, I guess.
Yeah.
What comes to mind?
Yeah. So the first two meals that come to mind are family meals. And the very first one is, I have never had Kraft mac and cheese or mac and cheese out of a box. Never. However,
Still never?
Never in my entire life.
Okay.
However, my mom makes a homemade mac and cheese casserole.
Nice.
Which is like my go-to meal when I like want to make something quickly, and it like mine never tastes as good as my mom's does. But like that, like I think is when I think of like what is our family meal, that's what I think of. But every time we had like a birthday, or it was the last night before we left for college, or last night before we go home, my mom always says like, what would you like me to make for dinner? And I always pick the exact same meal. And it's the most British meal that has ever existed.
Oh.
So it's roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, which is like this breaded, it's like a batter that's like baked and fried kind of, that you put gravy in, because it's not sweet. It's like,
a savory,
it's kind of tasteless. It's just a batter. It's like a plain batter, and that you put like gravy in, and then cauliflower, where my mom makes this like cheese sauce that goes on it, and then usually like roasted potatoes or something like that.
Great.
I know. It's like a well-rounded, very British meal. And that is always, my mouth is watering.
Yeah.
That is always the meal that I like pick. And it's just like, my mom is such a good cook. And so just like getting her to make this like really good meal is like, oh, so good.
That's pretty good. Hearing you describe it in detail is got my mouth watering.
Right?
So
that's funny.
I'm there with you. Nice.
Yeah. What about you? Do you have something that like makes you think cozy, home, that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. And they're both like Christmas or holiday related, because that's like a very strongly family associated mealtime for me. In my sort of as long as back as I can remember, but it probably started like teenage years. On Christmas morning, either my grandma or later on, my mom started doing this. My mom, and subsequently my dad as well, would make sausage strata, which is basically this like egg casserole dish. It's got sausage, it's got cheese, and it's like baked in the oven for like a good amount of time. And there's all sorts of like herbs and spices. So the smell of this dish coming out of the oven on Christmas morning is heavenly. So that became a tradition for us for years. And subsequently, when I moved out, one year my mom, or probably mom and dad, made me a whole casserole to bring home with me for on
Uh-huh.
Christmas Eve, and it subsequently leaked into my car trunk, so I did not have any sausage strata for that Christmas morning. It
No.
was, there was a tough one. But this brings me to my second thing, which is that my family, my wife and our daughter, we have developed our own tradition, which is that my wife makes homemade cinnamon rolls on usually Thanksgiving morning and or
Yeah.
Christmas morning.
Yum.
So it's that same vibe of like holiday, like just us,
Cozy. Yeah.
mealtime, cozy, under blankets, watching movies or just hanging out, and that smell coming out of the oven,
Yeah.
cinnamon, vanilla, sweet,
Especially cinnamon
sticky.
rolls, they have,
Oh
like,
my gosh.
such a distinct smell.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
yummy.
so those are definitely ones that it's like, oh my
Amazing.
gosh, are those like you sort of forget and then you
Uh-huh.
remember and you're so excited. So it's that kind of
Yeah.
feeling is really nice.
I just, looked up a sausage strata, and it looks
Mm-hmm.
so good, and it's so funny that you and I both picked, like, a cheese-based casserole.
Yes.
How
Yeah, I
very
don't know
white
what
of
it
us.
is. It's well, I think that's it's like a very like heavy, like let's all sit down and just have like a giant meal
Yeah.
vibe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
cozy. I
Mm-hmm.
love it. That sounds delicious, and now I'm hungry.
Yes. So what a better time for us to not eat and instead just talk for the next hour.
Yeah, go grab a
Um,
snack during the break.
there you go. Yes. So right after this break, we will come back and talk about Still Alice. Pop Psych 101 discusses mental health as it is portrayed in pop culture media. And because of this, we often cover sensitive topics that can be triggering for some listeners.
We also delve into the characters and plots of these stories, and therefore, spoilers abound.
So please use your discretion as you listen to the rest of the episode. Still Alice is a 2014 American drama written and directed by Richard Glatzer and Wash Westmoreland, and based on the 2007 novel by Lisa Genova. It stars Julianne Moore as Alice Howland, a linguistics professor diagnosed with familial Alzheimer's disease shortly after her 50th birthday. She and her family wrestle with the diagnosis for the remainder of the movie, and it's
Mhm.
really a tight examination of one person's, in many ways, like complete journey from I'm who I am. I'm a 50-year-old linguistics professor at Columbia, all the way to the end where I'm in essentially stage 7 of Alzheimer's and
Mhm.
need full caregiving, and can kind of get out words here and there, but is otherwise um, just hanging on. So really a riveting and intense portrayal of obviously a very real disease. So we're going to be talking about the physical implications, but obviously also we're going to be talking a lot about the sort of mental health implications, not just for Alice as she was navigating
Mhm.
this experience, but also her family.
Mhm.
So Haley, we don't see Alice go into therapy, but if we had, and let's just say we had seen Alice before her Alzheimer's diagnosis, which we sort
Mhm.
of do as she's doing like presentations and things like that, and she's at being celebrated for at her 50th birthday by her family. What are our initial impressions? Who is Alice?
Alice seems like a pretty high achiever, standard, like, individual in academia, right? She runs regularly. She
Mm-hmm.
gets meals with her family regularly. She has one strained relationship with a daughter who didn't quite do things according to plan. The other two children kind of did things according to plan, and those relationships are more smooth. Good relationship with her husband, seems to enjoy her job, seems to like the work
Yeah.
that she does there. Yeah, so like pretty standard, like high achiever, midlife professional.
Yeah, and no major problems, right? At least at the outset.
Mhm.
We saw, like we said, the very successful seem to be doing well for themselves, two
Mhm.
academics, right? And then we sort of get these initial hints, and it's like, gosh, it reminded me of almost like a zombie movie, and this just feels like a terrible connection, but it's like the way they dropped in the little hints of something's wrong,
Oh,
right?
mm-hmm.
So it's like, in the zombie movie, it's like somebody coughs into a tissue and it's
The
blood,
cough of
right?
blood.
It's like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
Uh-huh.
And because we know generally where this movie's going at the outset, we immediately notice these sort of hints of things that, oh, that's weird. She forgot a word in a presentation, or, oh, that's weird. She, just introduced herself to her son's girlfriend or daughter, or sorry, son's girlfriend
Girlfriend.
or fiance
Yeah.
twice.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so these sorts of things, and initially she kind of just brushes them off, but I thought, Haley, it'd be useful in our conversation today to lay out for people, for listeners, sort of what the stages of Alzheimer's are, and
Mm-hmm.
how both Alice and her family reckon with and cope with those developments.
Yeah, I think that's great. I don't know the explicit stages, and so this is a moment for you to educate me a little bit, and then we can chat about how she goes through them.
Yeah, so a lot of stage one, which is basically pre-symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
is an interesting thing for us to talk about, because as Alice eventually gets a diagnosis, which is still pretty early for her in terms of the symptoms that she's experiencing, she learns that it is a genetic, familial type
Mm-hmm.
of Alzheimer's. So as she learns this, she wants to see whether or not her three children also carry this gene and also
Mm-hmm.
are likely to develop some of this early onset Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
And devastatingly finds out that her oldest daughter also carries this gene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we see, over the course of some of these initial scenes, we see Alice find out. Then we see Alice inform her family that she has it and that it's also genetic. And then we see her daughter find out that she has the gene. And that's sort of the last that we hear from the daughter about her own,
Yeah.
possibly having to deal with this diagnosis. But this is the sort of before symptoms appear stage,
Mm-hmm.
often called preclinical Alzheimer's. It
Okay.
can begin as early as 10 or 15 years before people even have symptoms. So,
Mm-hmm.
one of the reasons this is such a hard disease to treat is that it can sort of exist before symptoms are prominent.
Mm-hmm.
And we sort of learn with Alice that because she's an intellectual, she's, especially for someone in linguistics,
Mm-hmm.
for a long time, she probably found ways to manage some of these symptoms
Mm-hmm.
before they became noticeable to anyone else, or even before she felt like it was such a problem that she needed to talk to a neurologist about.
Yeah. And so often people who are high achieving, high functioning, they find ways to adjust for things that they struggle with. And so those things often go unseen. A great example is ADHD. Like, I think a lot of people learn skills really early on that it goes completely undiagnosed because those skills have been implemented since they were young. And what's also interesting about these like beginning stages of noticing is I think in the beginning, like, and I'm obviously not a specialist in this area, but my kind of thought is like the quote unquote like mistakes or symptoms are probably more observable by others than by herself. So,
Sure.
like, introducing herself twice to somebody or saying, like, you told me that story already, or things like
Yes.
that, which also are completely normal memory things, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, oops, my bad.
Yeah.
But more likely to be seen from the outside, I think, in the beginning, I guess it would be like more like misplacing things that you might
Hmm.
notice, but then like the symptoms like losing time or losing direction or not knowing how to get home.
Sleeping problems. Yeah.
Yeah, that I think is when the individual would kind of start to notice themselves, but I'm guessing in the beginning it's like more observable from the outside, but not necessarily in a way that's like I'm worried about you, but more like God, like mom's forgotten my birthday like 4 years in a row. Like she used to remember all the time, right? Things like that and kind of like almost anger rather than
Oh,
like
sure.
concern. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Or things that you'd be quick to explain away through any number of other
Yeah, it's
causes,
aging,
right?
right? Yeah.
Aging. And I think she even sees a different doctor before she sees the neurologist, right? Where she just sort of, and it's like, oh, well, have you been sleeping well? Have you been
Mhm.
anxious or
Are you
depressed? And it's
stressed?
sort of,
Yeah.
what's your diet like? All these
Mhm.
sorts of things, looking for other explanations for some of these symptoms. And that's immediately her husband's reaction as well. Like, oh, well, you've been so stressed at work, or,
Mhm.
or you haven't been getting much sleep recently. We need a vacation.
Mhm.
The rush to explain it away, and of course, that sort of denial stage is one
Mhm.
that's easily recognizable because that sort of devastating diagnosis is much easier to deny and look for
Yeah.
some other cause than to deal with it head on.
Well, and also, like, it's only denial if she does have that diagnosis, right?
That's
Otherwise,
fair.
it's
Yes, of
like
course. If she's
probably
right.
right? Yeah, like, because I think more likely introducing yourself twice or telling the same story more than once or like getting a little bit turned around is more likely to be stress or age related brain farts,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so, like, explaining stuff away like that actually is thinking a horse rather than a zebra, right? Occam's
Hmm.
razor
Yep.
until it's not, which in
Well,
this
right. So,
case it's not, right?
exactly. And this
Yeah.
is this is where so stage 2 is basic forgetfulness, right?
Mhm.
Forgetting people's names, where they left their keys. By the way, I was super paranoid about like forgetfulness in the days after watching this movie.
Oh.
Like, oh my gosh, do I still remember all these people's names? And it's like I forget where my wallet is once a week anyway.
Uh-huh.
But now all of a sudden I'm watching this movie and I'm like, oh man, I should really start leaving it in one place all the time.
Occam's razor.
Yes.
It's probably a horse, Ryan. You're
Well,
okay.
but the point of this stage is that
Mhm.
it's easily to be sort of written off
Yeah.
as
Mhm.
normal aged
Yep.
forgetfulness, right? And especially because the person can still drive, work, and be social. She does have a high stress, high pressure job, but as far as we know, she's doing that successfully,
Yeah.
right? It's not until some of these later stages that we start to find out the
Mhm.
extent of which things have been going south.
Mhm.
But the way that south starts to turn pretty quickly, with stage 3 being noticeable memory difficulties, right?
Mhm.
So it's not just that I notice or my family notices, but it's
Yeah.
this sort of significant, oh, this is different. This is something's
Yeah.
wrong, something's
Mhm.
off, right?
So, like,
And I
her
think
forgetting her lectures or forgetting where she saved
yes,
information or forgetting
yes,
what's on the syllabus, like, a thing she has done hundreds of times,
yes.
right?
And
Yeah.
even the other really interesting example was, and I thought this was really well filmed in terms
Mhm.
of like showing someone's experience of this, was her getting lost on her run.
Yeah, that was so well filmed.
Yeah, because you really felt like you were experiencing it with her, where
Mhm.
she was like things got blurry. Not that she couldn't see, but that was sort of a representation of
Mm.
where am I?
Yeah.
Why is this guy offering people flyers right next to me? Just sort of
Uh-huh.
like context had been lost.
Yeah. She was still
Um,
in focus, and so,
yes,
like,
exactly right.
her experience was very clear, right? But
Yes.
the, like, what was going around her suddenly became a little bit artistically represented.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
when there's no obvious cause for that sort of experience, I have to imagine that that's incredibly scary. And we see her go home kind of shaken from this experience.
Mhm.
And if I'm remembering the timeline quickly, hadn't told her husband yet, when she was having this symptom, right? Or was
So I
that
believe that was the
was that right
moment that
after?
sent her to the
That's what I
neurologist.
was going to say.
Like, she
Yeah.
was like, "There's something
Okay.
wrong." So I
Yes.
think
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
She told him that she got lost, and he
Yes.
basically was like, "You're fine."
Yeah.
And she's like, "No, I didn't know how to get back."
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why this sort of noticeable memory difficulty stage is when it's pretty common for people to be diagnosed. And this is sort of what happens with Alice is
Mhm.
she reports some of these things and then we actually see her take one of the tests with the neurologist,
Mhm.
which was very stressful to watch because again, I'm like, okay, I need to remember this too. Do I remember it's Washington Ave in Hoboken and da da da? Because I think that's probably her experience as well. You
Mhm.
have to imagine that if you're in this testing scenario, you know what you're going to be tested on,
Uh-huh.
right? You know you're going to have to remember this stuff, but it's the nature of the test to bring you far enough away from that initial, thing you're going to remember or thing that you were told, that then to come all the way back from it is a test of your working memory.
Mhm.
So, and I think, it's a sort of, I found myself wondering, because you and I as therapists, obviously we do a lot of measurement based care at
Mhm.
times, where we use scales or scores and kind of
Mhm.
check in with people in those ways. And I've certainly worked with people in situations where answering the questions about anxiety is sort of its own anxious practice.
Totally, yeah.
Or conversely, with ADHD, you mentioned before, like, I know I'm taking this test to find out if I have ADHD. So does that inform how well I do on it, right?
Uh-huh.
And I think there's something about this, even just testing experience, which I think can be really stressful for people.
Certainly, yeah. So I, as part of becoming a psychologist, you learn how to do like assessments for
Yeah,
things like personality and learning
totally.
disabilities and autism and things like that. And there are a lot of like tests for working memory. But the thing about the tests is they are fairly simple tasks. So, for example, count backwards while also telling us the color of the number, I made that
Yeah.
up, but like that type of a task. And then each time it gets slightly harder. And you're meant to forget some of it. And I think that's what freaks people out, is that when it gets harder, they start to be like, oh no, what's wrong? However, many of these tests have been standardized, knowing that people aren't going to love like the process of it getting harder. And then you also are kind of taught how to like kind of observe distress tolerance and kind of comment on
Hmm.
whether that is
Yep.
playing a role in it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, certainly, like, if you're told like remember these things, you're going to have to tell them back to me, and then the person talks about a million other things, you're like, no, 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 I want to remember the first things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can understand how this sort of diagnosis experience can be very upsetting and anxiety inducing, for someone. And we see Alice as she receives this diagnosis and then finally does tell her husband in the middle of the night, no less, that his reaction is certainly not what she was looking for at that time. We got the sense that she, even if she wasn't accepting of it, like, had come into, like, this is my reality. I
Mm-hmm.
have been diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
This is real. And he kind of, rapid cycled through, that's ridiculous. No, you
Mm-hmm.
don't. They're crazy. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we'll get you
Let's
a
get a
referral to
second
someone
opinion.
else.
Yeah.
Yes. And even when he goes to the doctor with her, is like, isn't it possible it could be this other thing?
Mm-hmm.
Or, well, what are the treatment options? Surely we caught it this early. We can
Mm-hmm.
do something about it.
Yeah.
And it's hard to watch someone go through a difficult experience and also not get the support they need. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know what it was like for you watching her, bring her husband to that experience with her,
Mm-hmm.
but wow, I mean, it certainly was for me, reminiscent of experiences I've had working with people who, like, they tell their partner they were diagnosed with, ADHD, even like
Mm-hmm.
something like ostensibly lighter, but it's like,
Mm-hmm.
what are you talking about? You're not this, you're not that. And I think people have a resistance to things that feel like they're going to really shake up
The
the
status
reality
quo.
or
Yeah.
normalcy. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. We certainly see in that moment that the husband cycles through his own journey.
Yeah.
um, right? Like he obviously starts grasping for control in any place that he can, right? Like
Yeah.
asking all the questions, what can we change? What can we do? And then they get to the elevator and calls it, and it takes a while, and then he like calls it like six more times. And
Yeah.
that's just
Yeah.
a like, nothing is working the way I want it to
Hmm.
work kind of a
Yep.
reaction, which again, totally normal and totally expected and fair. And simultaneously, I agree with you, not what she needs in that moment. And so I do have like a little bit of compassion for him in that like he
Oh, sure.
is learning a scary thing himself, but also let's share this together. But I think I was going to say, I think they kind of do share it together, but I don't think they do.
Well, he gets to a better place with it over time, it seems like.
I
I
don't
I'll
know. Like,
say
I feel like they take separate journeys from that point
oh,
on.
100%. When
Yeah.
I say he gets to a better place, it's not necessarily a better place in supporting her. It's
Yeah.
more like he moves through anger and into a version of acceptance that allows him to,
Yeah. And I would
you know,
argue it's not acceptance, it's resignation. Like, to
oh,
me,
sure,
it feels like he's like,
sure.
well, this is my life now, rather than
Yes,
like,
that's fair.
okay, this is my wife's experience and I'm going to care for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sad, and, I have to say maybe part of it for me where I just found myself really not liking, her husband as a character.
Mhm.
It might have been, like, anti-Alec Baldwin bias, but there was something going on there where I'm just like, "This
I didn't like him
guy,
either.
just come on." Because and I think a lot of this is very normal, and I think empathizing with him is appropriate and recognizing that denial, that refusal to accept, is coming from that place of wanting things to still be the way that they are, right? Wanting
Mhm.
your, as he says, beautiful, intelligent spouse to be able to continue working and to be able to retire and to be
Mhm.
able to do all these things and be there as grandparents.
Mhm.
And a diagnosis like this represents something that's going to be very different from that future.
Mhm. Yeah, and I
So,
think it's
yeah.
so different when it's like a parent or a grandparent because we almost have a level of expectation that they will age faster than us, right?
Yep.
And so coming into something like this, there's almost this level of like, I don't like it and I have to grieve this person while they're still alive. However, when it's your partner, like I know so many marriages where there's, I mean, not so many, almost every single marriage, there's the like, well, when we retire type language, right? We'll go on
Absolutely.
that trip when we retire, stuff like that. And that goes away,
Yeah.
right? But it
Yep.
goes away while the person's still there. So there's like the, well, can we still take that trip? Like the
Can I
rather,
accept this job offer? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which, I mean, that's a whole story on its own. I'm
Yes.
like,
Yes.
yes, you can, but also like, don't change her environment too much because that's scary. Yeah. So, yeah, it's tough. You have to grieve a whole future that you had for yourself.
And look, we can totally empathize with that, but we also see him sort of set the tone for the other kids in how they try to support her through these
Hmm.
stages of her diagnosis.
Mhm. At least the oldest one, Kate Bosworth.
At least the oldest one for
Yeah.
sure, right? So obviously, they tell the kids, and it's this natural disbelief and questions,
Mhm.
and then it felt like within a couple of scenes, they were talking about her as if she wasn't in the room, but she
Ugh,
was.
I hate that so much.
And again, really hard to watch
Yeah.
because they're making plans for her or making plans for themselves, and we just sort of see her there and ostensibly hearing them talking, but also not an active participant in the conversation. It's just really
Well,
it's
and
sad.
even
Yeah.
prior to that, they're
Yeah.
talking about her while she is a participant in the conversation, right? So she's
Yes.
asking like, "Oh, please remind me again when it is so I can put it in my
Yes.
calendar." And Kate Bosworth does the like, "Oh, well, you don't even need to think about it, so don't worry about it."
Yes.
And Kristen Stewart does what I think is the kinder thing, which is like, let's just tell her. Like, we're gonna get her
Of
either
course you can put
way.
it in your
So,
calendar.
like, yeah, if
Yeah.
she forgets it, who cares? But if she
Mhm.
wants to try to remember it,
Yeah.
let her. Like, let's treat her like the human she is, right? And
Well, right.
if somebody asks you when something is, so they can put it in their calendar, you tell them, right?
Yeah, and we see Alice wrestling with that experience in these early stages, right? Writing down number or letter or words, excuse me, writing down words on the chalkboard to see if she can remember them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having questions that she kind of asks herself to start her day with on her
Mm-hmm.
phone, things basically to keep her active memory working,
Mm-hmm.
and ways that she can confirm to herself that she's sort of okay.
Mhm.
Um, and that's her, I think, also fighting off some of these early stages. So we
Yeah,
go from,
control.
yeah, exactly. So we go from these sort of noticeable memory difficulties, which I think she would acknowledge that she has, um, to then, more significant symptoms beyond memory loss, right?
Mhm.
Um, we would call them like other aspects of cognition, difficulty with language, organization, calculations, um, some difficulty performing daily tasks. And we see her have some really difficult conversations, with her daughter,
Mhm.
with her boss, right? So
Yeah.
it becomes clear that she wants to work as long as she can. And of course, we could understand with that being her career, but she has this meeting with her boss around basically the bad reviews that she's been getting as a professor. Well, I was going to ask you sort of what that scene was like for you, because I think for me that, you know, I think I'm doing okay, and actually now you're telling me that all my students have been hating this. Like, that'd be pretty devastating as a therapist too. I was like,
Yeah.
oh my god, the secret bad reviews is like just a devastating experience.
Yeah.
Almost like take the Alzheimer's out of it. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, that would be horrible to, like,
yeah,
think everything's going perfectly and then find out,
yeah,
like, everybody thinks it's going poorly.
yes, yes,
However, I think that's a very clear indication of kind of what I was saying earlier of, like, it can be seen from the outside more than it can be seen from the
absolutely,
inside, in that, like, she's not realizing that she's disjointed. She's not realizing that she's actually, like, not following a thread in class. She might notice like, "Oops, I couldn't find the thing for today, the discussion for today." But what she isn't picking up on is that that's happening multiple times per class, or it's happening multiple classes. And all of these reviews were like, "I signed up for this class because people have been raving about it for years."
yeah,
And what? Like, it was disjointed, she was disorganized, and I think that that's a good representation of kind of what the Alzheimer's journey looks like. Is
yeah.
the person themselves are aware that like things aren't going well, but they're not like, the context kind of goes away. And yeah, I think that that probably leads us into like the next stage of what Alzheimer's is.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really this isn't like a specific stage, but this sort of the theme that we start to see with Alice is really this loss of identity, right? So if she's not, Columbia professor,
Hmm.
maybe she can still hold on to being mom and then eventually grandma. Maybe she's still a runner, maybe she's still an academic in these circles with her husband.
Hmm.
But even those sort of outlets are progressively deteriorating as well. She doesn't want to go into social situations, whether it's because of embarrassment or fear
Hmm.
of embarrassing herself or her husband. We see her try to build relationships with her daughter, her youngest daughter, played by Kristen Stewart.
Hmm.
And, you know, I think from a good place, wants to know more about her, reads her diary,
Hmm.
wants to be able to connect with her, wants to feel like I know this person and I don't
Hmm.
need to remember. I can just kind of have this resource. But
Hmm.
then, of course, that's a breach of trust and there's
Hmm.
conflict there. And you can just see her wrestling with her own deteriorating capability.
Yeah. Well, and then also goes for a run and then chooses to go for froyo after. And then, like,
Yes.
that level of independence gets swiped out from under her by her husband, which understandable, like, understandably, he was concerned.
Terrified for her. Yeah.
And today you'd have an Apple Watch with location services. But um, she's like, "I'm an adult who wanted to go for a run and then get froyo. Just let me do it."
Yeah.
And like you said, like losing that identity piece of, I can't be around. And then also like being aware that you're losing your memory, but then kind of continually testing yourself.
Hmm.
That's got to be such like a preemptive grief. Like, who am I when I don't remember this? Which kind of leads into the video she leads herself, which is like,
Yeah.
when I'm no longer me. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so the video she makes for herself where it's basically like when you can no longer answer these questions, right? And I forget the
Yeah.
exact questions. I think it was basically like
your children's birthdays, your
Yeah, it was like this sort of rote
anniversary,
memory things
your
from
children's names.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep. When you can no longer remember these things, basically like here are the instructions for you to follow.
Hmm.
And I think I'm assuming us watching it, we recognize what this was maybe before
Uh-huh.
the sort of typical person just like, oh, what an interesting video that you're recording for
Yeah,
yourself.
like what instructions is she
What are you doing
leaving?
with that?
Yeah.
And then, we see the, take this whole bottle, don't tell anyone. And it's like,
Hmm.
okay, this is a preemptively planned suicide. I think, is
Hmm.
it fair to say that?
Yeah, no, it's a suicide plan. Yeah.
Yes. And, watching that, watching her record that, watching her not ever having to tell anyone that that's her plan or that's how
Hmm.
she's feeling, that was the heaviness of this experience, again, was a really, I think, sad part of this experience is that it wasn't in that moment when she made that video that she wanted to die right there and then,
Mm-mm.
right? This was an intent on wanting to be able to control when things get bad enough that I will still be able to make a choice over, what my life's going to look like.
Yeah. When I'm no longer me, right? When I no longer feel like me, and
Yeah.
she's determined that that day will be when she can't answer those questions, I don't want to exist anymore, right? Like I
Yeah.
want to choose to die in that moment. Um, yeah, like I think it's incredibly sad. And I also like it's not surprising to me that she doesn't share it with anybody.
Yeah.
And I think she like knows that her family's gonna take the pills away or delete
Right, that
the
she would lose
message
that
or
control, she would
yeah.
lose that option.
And she
Yep.
knows that she won't remember if they do that, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I think, kind of what we're talking about, this sort of 5th stage, which is really decreased independence, right? So, up until these stages where she's just sort of deciding she can't work anymore, you know, her kids kinda check on her, her husband's still working,
Mhm.
but then the independence starts to shift. So they go
Mhm.
and stay at their beach house together.
And they take shifts like, "I'm leaving, so this daughter will come in and watch you. I'll be
Yes.
fine." Like, no,
Yes.
you won't.
Yeah.
You got lost on the way to the bathroom."
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yep.
I even hear the tone of my voice, like, being like, "Yeah," which, like, actually really annoys me that I'm doing that. But, like, we do feel sad for people who are struggling with Alzheimer's and
Oh my
also, like,
gosh.
in these stages the stage we're hitting now, it kind of starts to disappear a little bit, but the stages prior to now, that kind of tone that I was using is probably like one of the worst things you can do because of that desire
Mm,
to remain whole and remain oneself and
right.
remain independent. To have people go like, "It's okay, mom. You don't need to remember that." Like,
Right.
stop it.
Oh,
Let me remember
well, right. And that's
it.
like, am I being spoken to as if I'm a child, or am I
Yes.
being spoken to as if I, can't take care of myself? And on one hand, it's like, yes, because we are worried you are not someone who can take care of
Mhm.
themselves. But to your point, I think that there's so much power in staying on that level of validation and empowerment. And I'm treating you like you're an adult. If you tell me you know where the bathroom is, I'm going to let you figure that out.
Yeah.
Right. And then if you, unfortunately, again, a very devastating scene is she's realizing the depth of her illness
Mhm.
when she gets lost looking for the bathroom at the
Yeah.
beach house and goes to the bathroom on herself.
Yeah.
And then her husband finds her. That's like, she's conscious enough to realize that happened to her and what it means that that's happening to her.
Mhm. And
So
also, I
this
think
is,
he
yeah.
handles that moment really beautifully.
So
Like,
that's what I was
that's,
going to
like,
say. I was going to give
one
him some
moment
credit for that. Yeah.
yeah, where
Yeah.
he was like,
Yeah.
"Okay, let's go clean
Yep.
you up."
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they still want to go on runs with her. They still want to talk to her about their career. They still want her to be grandma when
Mhm.
the twins come around. But there's also the recognition of, well, what is she capable of, and what and the scene. Oh my gosh, when the twins are born, and she's like, I know how to hold a baby,
Uh-huh.
and it's like she's desperately clinging to these things of herself that she
Mhm.
knows she's capable of, but
Mhm.
people are still, understandably, very
Mhm.
nervous
Yeah.
around what she can and can't do.
Yeah, I really loved that moment because Kate Bosworth's character has been infantilizing her kind of
Yep.
repeatedly. And in that moment, she's the one that says, like, yeah, you can hold them. Like, she's
Hmm.
the one that's like, yes. And
Yeah.
I love that because she's connecting with her mom over her child. And I thought that was like a really lovely connected moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this sort of decreased independence stage, though, stage 5, we see her husband, helping her get dressed in the morning.
Hmm.
We see her. I don't know. She doesn't necessarily experience paranoia, but things like paranoia or delusions or hallucinations are common during this stage.
Hmm.
And we know from talking about other mental health diagnoses that these sorts of symptoms can be incredibly troubling, both for the individual as well as the sort of people attempting to support them.
Hmm.
It can be really scary, because especially if someone is sort of independent enough to be leaving the house and maybe going for a walk or a run,
Hmm.
but also at risk enough that that could lead to them getting lost. It's a huge risk,
Hmm.
deciding, can they still drive? Can they leave the house unsupervised? This sort of
Can they
stage is a
spend
really
time unsupervised?
difficult one to
Yeah.
navigate. Yep.
Yeah. And the hallucinations and paranoias and things like that, I think is an incredibly hard stage as well for caregivers and family members because
Yeah.
that is also the stage where the narrative starts to become disjointed. And so oftentimes caregivers and loved ones will react with like fact checking or trying to like understand the story or trying to like explain that like no that's not there. And because the person is in this stage of mental health, like they that's not super useful, like that
Nope.
information that you're giving them is not really going to sink. And basically the transition of Alzheimer's is from like a language narrative context based experience into a visceral emotional experience. I would say an emotional and then a visceral experience. So
Yeah.
it becomes kind of more about what the person is feeling and their emotional experience, and then it more just becomes about their body and what their body is presenting, and um, it loses that narration, loses that context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was one scene I wanted to come back to because I thought it was another example of just like a really powerful both portrayal and just sort of part of Alice's story, which is her neurologist sort of encourages and opens her up to this opportunity to be a speaker at a conference.
Uh huh.
And this she's right in this sort of like stage 3, stage 4, where if she's going to pull this off, it requires like an incredible amount of memory and
Mm-hmm.
like preparation and energy.
Mm-hmm.
And we see her wrestling with that as she's writing and
Mm-hmm.
highlighting things over and over and over again and reading her speech over with her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, in many ways, and it's sad, but it's like her last triumph, her last, really thing that probably felt the most like her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is I'm telling the story, and even in the moment, overcoming, dropped note cards and
Oh my
things like
gosh.
that.
Always number
Yeah.
your pages or your note cards when you're giving a speech.
Yes. Yes.
Staple it together in the corner.
Yeah, but oh my gosh, that was one of the scenes watching for me where it's just like, because part of you, I shall say part of me watches that scene thinking like, and they sort of acknowledge that like this could plateau, the developments of these symptoms could plateau
Mm.
where she's able to, or a person with Alzheimer's can sort of stay at a acknowledging like a certain level of debilitation, but
Mhm.
also of cognition, that
Mhm.
she could still be reasonably independent. She
Mhm.
could still have some degree of working memory. So of course there's hope for that as you watch her doing this, is maybe she can maintain this. Maybe if she
Mhm.
can do this, maybe there's like something that will kind of stay with her.
Mhm.
Right. And then we contrast that scene with her visiting sort of like the old folks' home of elder patients with Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And she knows she's, again, at the severe level of these symptoms are sort of starting to onset. And it's like, here's where you might end up. And it's just like, oh my gosh. It's like
Mm-hmm.
the roads are splitting. And it's like, maybe I could hold on and still do this kind of thing. But this is sort of more likely. And
Mm-hmm.
she sees the room, and um, she says it's all women, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
like this recognition of like, because she, I guess in the movie, was it her mom or her grandma also had it?
I think when she gets the diagnosis and they figure out it's the familial one, I think there is a
Yeah,
moment of like,
some
this makes
recognition,
so
right?
and so
Yeah, yeah,
like make more sense.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I am. So just some self-disclosure, like I have an older family member who has Alzheimer's and lives in a memory care facility. And it's not as chaotic as that scene
right.
was.
Yeah,
However, like it's a lot like that. Like
yeah,
you go in and it's a lot of people kind of like lost in their own heads. And
mm-hmm.
my family member used to sit next to the same woman every day, and I would go and visit and would I like formed kind of a relationship with the woman next to my family member, and she in some ways had more cognition than my family members, and in other ways had less. And like she would like remember me and be like, "Oh, I know you," but she couldn't like speak
Yeah,
with
like
me
place
and
it.
things like
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yep,
um Whereas my family member had no idea who I was but could speak with me and hold a
yeah,
conversation with me.
yeah.
And that's the thing, is like not everybody's like journey looks the same, not
Oh,
everybody's
100%.
progression looks the
Yeah,
same. And the luckily the facility that my family member is a wonderful facility, and
yeah.
it's
That
such
makes a
good
big
care.
difference.
It
Yeah,
really is. And the one in this movie seemed that way as well. But I think if I had the diagnosis and I walked in there, I don't know that I would I almost, knowing myself, I would be like, I want you to give me all the information, right?
sure,
Like
sure.
I want to go in there and I want to see. But at the same time, like now that I've seen, and I'm like, if I get that diagnosis, don't take me to a memory care facility. Like
Sure.
just
Yeah.
just let me
Yeah.
slowly progress there, and then when I'm there, you can move me to the facility.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's so
it's hard.
interesting. Because I guess for me, in sort of, I hinted at why this movie was so scary for me, and I think again, in like a little bit of self disclosure, I think this is something that our patients and people that I work with deal with as well, which is like this fear of being a burden on people around you, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's I have PTSD or I have anxiety or I have OCD or whatever it is, or I have Alzheimer's, not wanting that experience to be a weight or a negative
Mhm.
influence or experience for other people around you.
Mhm.
And my brain was like, "Oh my gosh, just put me in there whenever. Just like I'll go.
Oh
I
my
should
gosh.
go.
No
I'll
one
go." No,
ever
no,
knew.
I know. No,
Yeah.
but partly
Yeah.
out of that sense of like, I'll be with people whose job it is to take
Yeah.
care of me,
Yeah. I'll
and
pay
you can come
somebody
see me
to do
whenever
it.
you want. I'll
Yeah.
be there, and maybe I'll remember you, maybe I
Yeah,
won't.
and
But
that's
like
your
that's
version of
yeah,
your future plan, right? Like hers
yes,
looks
exactly right.
different than yours.
Yes,
and
right, of
and I
course.
think what is interesting is like the burden concept. To me, I kind of feel like the narrative in the story was kind of like, well, the husband like kind of like loves her and supports her, but kind of finds her a burden a little bit. That's
Yeah,
the feeling that
yeah.
I got.
Mhm.
Whereas the Kristen Stewart character gave the vibe of like, taking care of you is not a burden to me. Like
That's right.
you as
She
my
actually
mother,
moved
like
back.
our
Yes.
relationship is a little bit painful,
Yes.
but that's just because that's us, not
Yeah.
because of like what you're going through.
Yeah.
And I think that I hope that every family has one of those, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that sort of stage of the illness for Alice when her youngest daughter, played by Kristen Stewart, comes back basically to. Uh, I guess the sense what I got was that she was moving in because Dad was moving to Chicago or was moving to Minnesota to take that job.
Oh, okay. I missed that plot point.
Okay, so that's the sense that I got. Was he was like, "I'm doing this. Thank you for kind of taking this responsibility on,"
Mm-hmm.
and she was willing to do that because she could, ostensibly still get acting jobs in New York City and kind of
Mm-hmm.
also be at home with mom. But yeah, to your point, in many cases, it does fall to someone to be the caregiver, whether by default or someone volunteers or by choice, volunteering, voluntold.
Yeah.
That caregiving experience does emerge, right, as part of this, especially as part of this illness, because as
Mm-hmm.
we acknowledge, like these severe symptoms become so severe that independence is basically impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you don't know what to do when the fire alarm goes off, if you don't know what to do when the phone rings,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of becoming more dependent on others just for those basic interactions,
Yeah.
while sad, is also important
Mm-hmm.
to make
Yeah.
sure that, what that life is going to look like.
Yeah. And I think like one thing as we talk about kind of like the caregiving, a moment that I thought was really powerful between Kristen Stewart and Alice was when Kristen Stewart's character said, "What does it feel like?" And she tells her, and then afterwards she's like, "Thanks for asking." And I think
Yeah.
that that really summarizes like we as a culture are afraid of illness. We're afraid
Yeah.
of death. We're
Yeah.
afraid of putting people out. And so we don't ask the questions. And to me, the like not talking about it, not asking her about her experience is kind of like talking about her in the room, right? Of
Yes.
like
Yes.
we all know it's here, but like just ignore it. And what Kristen Stewart did was she was like, tell me what you're going
Yeah.
through. And I don't think that she did that with intention. I think it's because she truly was curious about her mother's
Oh,
experience,
absolutely.
and it happened to be the right thing to do. It becomes very clear that she's the natural caregiver in the family,
Hmm.
in the way the movie presented it. But I thought that was a really wonderful experience because so often when we are supporting somebody through a breakup or through an illness or through mental health or through uh, being fired, like whatever it might be, we so often try to like solve it or fix it or distract them from it. And
Yeah.
sometimes you just need to say, like, hey, what is it? How are you feeling? Like,
Yeah.
what's your experience?
Yeah.
And not try to be like, oh, that's my experience too, or I know that as well. But also like, yeah, that sucks. I hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it really comes down to validation and your desire and openness to hearing that person's experience
Uh-huh.
versus trying to stop making that their experience.
Yes.
Um,
Or trying to
whether through
control the
distraction or
experience.
through,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and look, again, we can empathize with people who try to address the situation this way, right? Because it's like, oh, well, let's not be sad. Let's just watch
See the
TV, or
best,
let's,
yeah. I
yeah,
think that's
yeah,
also a very natural reaction as well.
100%.
Yeah.
But we're also recognizing that that doesn't ease anyone's experience, right? Even if you put the TV on, it's a
Mhm.
distraction. You're still thinking about it, and
Yeah.
they're still experiencing it that way.
Uh-huh.
So nothing has gotten better, and it's not a guarantee that if you ask someone, "Hey, what is this like for you?" that
Mhm.
that's going to result in this, naturally
Yeah.
important beneficial outcome. But that validation as
Yeah.
a broad
Yeah.
sort of trend
And
can be
also,
really
like, I
healing.
think
Yeah.
this isn't a black and white thing, right? So it's like,
Right.
do a little bit of both, right? Like,
Sure.
do a
Sure.
little bit of like, let's just turn the
Absolutely.
TV on,
Yep.
um, and also do a little bit of like, hey, what's going on for you in any
Hmm.
relationship at any time?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's stage 6, and we don't see a lot of stage 7. But stage 7 Alzheimer's is basically lack of physical control. The individuals may need round the clock care with the simplest things like walking, sitting, or even swallowing. So
Hmm.
this can have a really a devastating uh, conclusion, more or less, to what this disease can do to people. So for people who are caregivers, seeing people go through this experience, it's, I think, very natural to
Hmm.
whether it's kind of go through those stages of grief early, or be really anxious or really confused, frustrated. Like tension and agitation can build up for people with Alzheimer's. So
Yep.
wrestling with that conflict that can come up can be a really big challenge. And it's funny because I'm reading, this is from basically a well-known hospital's website,
Mm-hmm.
and it's remember that they're unaware of what they're doing at this point, so don't take it personally.
God,
which
it's
is
so true though.
which is right, accurate and good advice, but
Yeah.
easier said than done.
Truly. And also
Yeah.
like I think something that does happen, not quite at I mean, it happens at stage 7 as well, but in the like slightly earlier ones, like if you're out in public, the person with Alzheimer's starts doing weird stuff. And it's because
Yep.
like social rules are just a narrative,
Yes.
right? And if you're living in a world where like you're losing those contextual narratives, like you're going to do a weird thing because like you
Yeah.
don't have that narrative anymore. And
Yeah.
I
You
think
don't know
that's
which way
also
to face in the elevator.
yeah, that's the example I was going to give too. And it's also like in those moments, it's really important to be like, this isn't personal. Like
Hmm.
they're not doing it to be embarrassing. If I am embarrassed, that's my shit, my stuff,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the sort of scene that you mentioned is where we really end the movie, which is um Alice and her daughter still finding a way to connect, right? Alice
Mhm.
basically running her lines with her mom, and asking her, what does that mean, right? And she says, love. And it's like, yeah, mom, love. And I got to say, I liked ending it on that note because
Mhm.
reading stage 7 and kind of seeing where this goes from there,
Mhm.
I think that's a natural way to acknowledge that this is its own sort of ending.
Mhm.
That this is as much of a relationship and as much of a version of Alice as there is. So it's,
Mhm.
a way to tell her story,
Yeah.
emphasizing that person.
Yeah. And I think once you get to stage 7, all that you can do is love the person,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and so I think that is, like you said, a beautiful way to end it. Very artistically done.
Hmm. So that wraps up Still Alice, and despite it being a hard watch, Haley, we should still do some reviews, let the people know what we thought of this, and I will start us off by asking you how you think this movie was rated, and then we can do our own ratings. So.
Ooh, what was the Rotten Tomatoes for
Yes.
it?
So I have an audience score and a critic score, and I don't know if this hint's going to help or hurt your guess, but they are exactly the same. So there's a consensus
Ooh,
between audience and
I'm
critics
going to
on
say
Still Alice.
68%.
While you are uncharacteristically off, this movie got an 85% tomato meter.
Wow. See, that's funny. I would have given it a higher critics rating and a lower audience
So
rating.
I did throw you off a little bit.
You did. But what I would have guessed for I basically ultimately guessed for the audience, which
Yeah.
is why I said 68.
Oh, sure.
Um Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. 2.5 stars from Mr. Roger Ebert. So, take that for what you will.
Yeah. Out of 5?
Yeah. So he was a little
Yeah.
bit more
Yeah.
critical, I guess,
I
than
think he and I fall
he
similarly.
trends in that direction, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's true. He's a grump.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't know you. Maybe you're not a grump. That's funny.
Yeah. So perhaps we should do our reviews. So, Haley, as we think about our own reviews, let's say on a scale of 1 to 5 college lectures, because that lecture hall
Mhm.
really brought me back.
Uh-huh.
Um, how would you rate the accuracy of Still Alice?
I would say 4. And I think part of the reason why I say 4 is because I think this movie is very artistically done in a way that is highly representative of the progression of Alzheimer's. So
Hmm.
I think like for example, we see a scene where she's frantically looking for her phone in the middle of the night. And
Oh,
then I
yes.
think it's like the very next scene or like a scene soon after where he finds the phone and she goes, "Oh, I was looking for that." And then he goes, "That was a month ago." And I
Oh
think by like
gosh. But
putting
the way they
those,
shot it, it
yeah,
was all felt like it was all one night. Oh
yes,
my
right? So,
gosh.
like, having
Yes.
those
Ugh.
scenes right next to each other, I think was like a very like meaningful representation of like
Yeah.
time gets a little warped and
Yep.
what you remember gets a little warped and how you see the world gets a little warped. And we described the scene where she got lost and like she was perfectly clear, but the world was blurry. And
Yeah.
I think I really loved how like the people who tried to connect logically with her kind of struggled. And then the person, Kristen Stewart, who tried to connect more like just like emotionally, more just like, let's take a walk and I'm going to be like, Mom, don't give me a hard time about it. Like connected more closely, more intimately. I think that really mirrors the progression of Alzheimer's from that like that language-based narrative to the like body-based emotional experience
Yeah.
transition. Yeah, I think it loses a point because it's a short movie and so like
Sure.
it like it's almost as though it's like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step
It's
5,
sort of
step
like an
6.
incomplete.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
like almost happens too quickly and like nothing
Mhm.
really happens development wise. However, with a disease like this, there is no specific timeline. And so like any
Just like
movie,
the stages of grief are not linear, like this is just
yeah.
sort of like a
Yeah.
combination of
And
things.
so
Yeah.
like if they're going to hit all the points in an hour and a half to 2 hours, like they have to kind of hit them quickly, but then also things feel a little underdeveloped.
Mhm.
But again, like that's, like the way that it's shot is very kind of like artistically Alzheimer's-y. So I think it was done pretty well. Again, I'm not an Alzheimer's specialist, but I am somebody who has had like some experience witnessing it. And it felt realistic from the outside, from somebody observing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
This was already going to be my rating scale, and I brought it up. On a scale from 1 to 5 lost cell phones.
Oof.
How, and I think that's almost a good scale for you. How entertaining did you find this movie?
So I compared the zombie movie, which I feel bad about, but I made that comparison because I watched this movie the same way I watch a horror movie. Have you ever seen
Hmm.
It Follows?
Do you think I've seen It
No, of
Follows?
course. I don't know why. Well, so it's another scary movie where it's like the whole conceit is like something is following me, but I never see it, and I just have
Uh-huh.
this feeling of it following me,
Oh,
and like
miserable. Oh.
it had just the same vibe where this whole time I'm watching this movie, and it feels like this person is being stalked by this invisible thing, and the
Yeah.
only time you like feel it getting closer and closer and more dangerous and
Ooh.
worse, and I was watching it like oh no, the killer's right behind you, but like you never get that okay, that scene's over because it's just keeps going and it's
Hmm.
just the next day or sometimes the next month. And wow, I mean, I wouldn't call it entertaining in the sense of like, oh wow, that was really entertaining.
Uh-huh.
I would call it entertaining in the sense of uh, gripping,
Enthralling.
devastating, enthralling.
Hmm.
Yes, yes. So if that is an experience that you are looking for, this movie did that to me, I will say.
Hmm.
So gosh, I don't know what score that means.
I also
I
don't think you have to give it one if it doesn't feel like if it doesn't feel like it fits.
No, I know.
You
I
can be
mean,
like,
so
it's a
I
phone call on that phone.
yes, yeah, and even and we didn't talk about the sort of like quote unquote conclusion of the sort of suicide plan, but like that scene is sort of like a good encapsulation of this movie where it's like she's so close to something terrible but maybe also okay thing happening,
Uh-huh.
like, and in that sense each sort of subsequent is like okay, well, this is real. And I think
Mhm.
that's why the accuracy rating I think is just almost the more important. So I'll just stay on the same. I'll give the same number that you gave,
Great.
just as a way of acknowledging like, wow, this was
Mhm.
a lot.
Yeah. I'll take that
But
phone and I'll call the accuracy rating.
okay, there we go. But
Yeah.
yeah, and kudos to Julianne Moore, a really incredible portrayal.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was
And like
really.
Kristen Stewart gets a lot of flack as an actress, but I think she's wonderful. Like
She
she's
was
in
really
a
good in
lot of
this
my favorite
movie.
movies. Yeah,
Yes,
I've never seen
yes.
the vampire movies, but she's in a lot of my favorite movies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read a familiar criticism was just like, she's just herself, right? This is
Yeah.
just her being like, I'm just Kristen Stewart. I'm
Yeah.
an
But
actress.
she nails it, right?
But she does it so well.
Yeah.
Yes, and it was very
It's
believable
like
and
Michael Cera, but he
touching.
nails it, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. She nails being herself. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's still Alice, Haley. So we reached the end. Thank you everyone for coming along this ride with us. We promise to do lighter fare in the future, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge that some of these difficult, scary things are out there
Mhm.
because people have to encounter them a lot of different ways. So
Yeah.
yeah.
We gotta do the thanks for asking, thanks for talking about it kind of thing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. And thank you all for listening to us talk about it.
Yeah.
And if you want to send us other suggestions, please feel free to do so at PopPsych101 on Twitter, on Facebook, or you can email us,
And Instagram.
PopPsych101, and Instagram, yes, thank you, at gmail.com. And thank you all, as always, for listening. We have new episodes coming up. So check back to your feeds sometime soon.
Bye.
Bye.